They brought brochures to my own kitchen like I didn't know how to breathe on my own anymore. Brochures to my own kitchen like I didn't know how to breathe on my own anymore. My name is Gwendolyn Harris, and I am 68 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe it's time for us to stop carrying everyone else and start protecting our peace. I sat at my mahogany table while my son and daughter handed me glossy pamphlets for a place they called comfortable and safe. And in that precise, quiet moment, I understood that my decades of loyalty had been read as weakness. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to, there's a photograph on my kitchen bulletin board of me, hair pinned back with a scarf, holding a baby Andre in one arm and a grocery bag in the other, ribbon in my hair, apron dusted with flour, and a Sunday pot of collard greens simmering on the stove. That picture is the shorthand of my life: provider, cook, disciplinarian, bank, shoulder. Andre was 12 when his father left. Tiffany was 8 when bills started arriving with menacing stamps. I never thought of myself as heroic. I thought of myself as necessary. I worked a day job at the community bank and tutored neighborhood kids in the evenings. I kept the brownstone because it was our family anchor, a 3-flat with high ceilings, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where we always had room for one more plate at Sunday dinner. The money I poured in wasn't glamorous. It was the electricity for Andre's teenage room when he forgot to pay bills. It was tuition to keep Tiffany from dropping out. It was a down payment scraped together when Andre decided to open a small catering truck. When Andre's business hit that messy patch, I wrote checks so vendors wouldn't call at midnight. When Tiffany brought a man home who was good at charming people and bad at paying rent, I let her stay upstairs rent-free for months because, God, she was my baby. Each favor came wrapped in excuses. They'll be okay if I help now, I'd say. Each favor grew a little expectation. Each expectation became a quiet debt. Neighbors noticed. Mrs. Daniels from next door would drop by with a slice of cake and say, "Gwen, you can't do everything." I would laugh and say, "Lord knows I try." The truth was softer than the laugh. I didn't want to be the reason my children failed. I watched both of them flail and thought my patience would stitch them back together. I gave until a new kind of silence settled on my nights. The hum of the thermostat, the unanswered texts asking for just a little more, and the rumors of loans taken out that I'd know nothing about until a collection notice appeared in the mail. One spring afternoon, Andre called me frantic. His supplier wanted a lump sum for fresh produce or the truck didn't run. He promised to repay me by next month. I lent him the money. A week later, Tiffany asked if she could borrow the equity in her upstairs room's rental unit for a short bridge. I signed the permission, which in my head was a temporary kindness. I started to pay for small repairs around the house because that's what you do to keep your family's foundation steady. Those payments blurred together. Repair, loan, tuition, bail, new tire. Old couch replaced. My ledgers were full of little compromises. Then came the brochures. They arrived at Sunday dinner like a cold gust. Tiffany laid a glossy pamphlet on the table, Serene Gardens Retirement Community, with smiling seniors doing Tai Chi in a manicured courtyard. Andre folded his hands like it was a family intervention. "Mom," he said, and his voice had that honeyed edge of someone trying not to sound harsh. "It's time. We think it's safer for you." Their faces were impassive, the way people try to be when they're asking for something big. I cleared my plate without saying much. My chest tightened, but my hands reached for the iced tea like a practiced actress. I had been the rock so long I had forgotten how to register shock in public. They assumed my silence was agreement. Before the dishes were washed, Tiffany had started listing logistics, costs, move-in dates, the idea of freeing up the brownstone to help them all get on track. There was a line in the way she spoke, a neatness that stripped away tenderness. They had rehearsed this. They believed they were doing me a favor, and themselves a favor, both at once. They had convinced themselves the house was an asset meant to be liquidated, a last-ditch inheritance to fix decades of poor decisions. What they didn't see was the ledger that wasn't on paper, the memories, the way that house held my identity, the years it took rent-free hands to learn to say please. They left that night with the brochures folded in their pockets and me with a quiet that felt like bruising. I washed plates slowly and let the hot water run until the kitchen smelled of lemon and steam. There was a sound behind my ribs I couldn't name. Resentment? Exhaustion? And I did what I'd done to tens of other problems. I prayed. I told God I'd keep doing what was right, but prayer felt different. It no longer soothed by itself. Instead of healing my heart, the prayer highlighted where I had been exhausted into invisibility. I slept badly. In the dark, I considered the small ledger entries, the midnight calls, the unpaid guarantees. A decision began to take shape, like frost on the window. What if kindness could change into something else, something that looked like protection for myself? The very next Sunday, they came back with more than brochures. Andre arrived with a woman from the bank, nice shoes, a polite smile, a manila envelope full of forms. Tiffany had a friend of hers, a notary, waiting in the car for convenience. They sat as if to a meeting of the elders and treated me like a reluctant participant. "We want you to sign a power of attorney," Tiffany said, voice soft. "So we can handle these things for you, bills, health care, the house when you're not able." They said it like a precaution, a small bureaucratic box to tick. Their eyes said, "It will be better for you to leave it to us." I watched their mouths and counted the ways entitlement made itself comfortable. Andre couldn't help the little smirk when he said, "Mom, it's just paperwork. You can still come see us every day." Tiffany kept twisting a napkin between her fingers, practicing a softness that didn't reach her eyes. "You don't want the hassle, Mama," she said. "We'll take care of it." The notary smiled like someone who has seen this 100 times, people signing away convenience for the illusion of being taken care of. In their planning, they made me into an object to arrange, not a woman to consult. They were sincere in the same way a storm is sincere. Their belief in their entitlement was practical. The house, they argued, could fund better health care and remove the risk of them having to worry about Mom every day. "You've given so much," Andre told me, as if rest were the right payment. But what they didn't admit was that the better health care they'd mapped to my future was really collateral to their collapsing businesses. "If we sell the house," Tiffany said, "we can fix the truck, pay suppliers, get Andre's catering truck back on track. He's almost there." They had rehearsed this story until it felt like truth. That night, I sat at the little desk in my bedroom and pulled out old bills, canceled checks, and the hand-scrawled notes that had been my memory. There was a fear in me I had never named before, not the fear of being alone, but the fear of being used into poverty by my own flesh. I called an old friend from church, Pastor Elaine. She listened, then asked what I wanted. "You to stay your own person, Gwen," she said. "Keep your name." It was the simplest prayer, but it sounded like armor. That conversation was the first of many that became new events. I started to call a lawyer the next morning. When Andre texted the next day, "We'll pick up the papers," I called him back and asked to meet at the kitchen table. He looked surprised I had pushed. He had assumed compliance. Tiffany tried the gentle approach first. She brought me a casserole and sat like someone who might wait until permission was granted. I surprised them both by asking one question. "Why now?" Andre's answer was honest and ugly. "The bank called. The loan matured." Tiffany added, "We can't keep up with everything, Mom. It's time to let go." Their explanation had the economy of desperation. Liquidate the one remaining asset. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I found my voice small and steady. "You aren't going to sign me away in the kitchen," I said. The notary pretended not to hear. They believed their plan could be carried out with efficiency and a few signatures. They'd been counting on me being too drained to fight. Instead, the words landed like ice. My steadiness wasn't fury. It was a recalibration. There was a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with resentment and everything to do with setting a boundary. They weren't asking. They were trying to reassign a life. Before they left, Andre said, almost as an afterthought, "Mom, if we sell, you'll be happier. Miami has good sunshine." He attempted a charm I knew too well. Projection turned into persuasion. It was then I felt something shift from sorrow to decision. I watched them go down the walk, each of them convinced they'd handled the negotiation with kindness. They left brochures, forms, and the smell of aftershave in the hall. I closed the door and stood still, listening to the house breathe around me, boards settling, pipes murmuring. I let the silence last until it tasted like resolve. The change wasn't loud. I didn't storm or scream. That wasn't my way. Instead, I slept like someone who had finally written an answer on an exam she'd been taking all her life. In the morning, I called Miss Ortiz, the real estate agent who had once sold a friend's brownstone and who had a reputation for closing quick and clean. I wanted her to know I was considering selling, and I wanted an appraisal. Calling her was a small transgression and also a first act of self-preservation. By noon, she had come by with stacks of market reports and a notepad. She asked one question I hadn't expected. "Where do you want to go, Gwen?" I surprised myself with the answer, "Somewhere with palms." After Ms. Ortiz left with her notes and promises, I sat at the old kitchen table and pulled out family photo albums. I turned the pages slowly, fingers tracing faces I had fed, clothed, and loved into adulthood. There was Andre as a toddler, legs smeared with mud from the alley behind the brownstone, Tiffany practicing a piano piece at 7, me holding both of them at graduation. Each photo answered why I had done what I did and asked if it had been worth the cost. The ledger in my head recalculated all the small favors, the bailouts, the unpaid promises. The house was more than mortar. It was memory, but it was also a vault that had kept me in service long after my own life had room for joy. My first concrete action was procedural and quiet. I called the bank account where Andre and Tiffany had access to the household checking, small automatic transfers I'd set up years before. I asked about removing authorized access. "We can do that, Mrs. Harris," the teller said. "We'll need you to come in with identification." I went the next afternoon and removed their access. The conversation was peaceful. Their names came off the account like lemon peel. It was more than financial hygiene. It was a closing of one door and the opening of another. That night, I made an appointment with an attorney I'd met through Pastor Elaine. We discussed the power of attorney request and the best way to protect my autonomy. The attorney, Ms. Clark, was firm. "You have every right to refuse," she said. "You can sell your property, you can change beneficiaries. If they try to force a signature, you can call us." She explained how quickly decisions could be executed legally if I kept everything documented. As I signed the retainer, I felt a shift that was practical, protection through process. A week later, after Ms. Ortiz set up an open house and the developer made a fair, fast offer, I made the calm decision to accept. The developer, Lakeshore Properties, wanted to convert the building and close within 45 days. The offer was full market price, not the lowball I'd half feared. Acceptance meant relinquishing my anchor, yes, but it also meant freedom from being a bank to my children. I instructed Ms. Ortiz to list as is and told no one else. There was a reason I moved quietly. When desperation is loud, it invites manipulation. The first sign went up on the lawn, a discreet, professional placard with the word "Sold" in heavy white letters on glossy black. That afternoon, as if to seal the change, a moving truck pulled up to the curb. The driver, a young man named Luis, who handled possessions like they were fragile human histories, smiled when he saw me watching. He asked about any fragile china and if I wanted to have a box labeled "Do Not Open Until Miami." I nodded. Packing was a ritual that strapped my grief into neat boxes and put it on a forklift. When they began to load, I walked through my kitchen and ran a hand over the counter that had known every foreclosure letter and every baby scrape. Among the boxes went the photo albums. I placed one last photograph, the one with the ribbon in my hair, on top of a box labeled "Keep." I kissed the frame and left it on the table. I called Pastor Elaine and told her I'd accepted the offer. She laughed, a sound like blessing, and told me to take my passport. I booked a small one-bedroom in a high-rise in Miami with a balcony and a view of palms. I did not make it dramatic. there were no scenes. I paid for a moving company, signed documents, and arranged for my mail to forward. Before the truck left, Andre and Tiffany returned, unannounced and breathless, their faces a mixture of anger and panic. They had been at a bank signing something, a notary in tow, convinced that with a power of attorney they could force my hand. Tiffany thrust a sheaf of papers at me. "Gwen, sign here," she said, her voice pitched toward command. I looked at them, and then at the sold sign on the lawn outside, and something like snow settled around my heart. I raised a hand, not in anger, but to slow them down. "I already made my plans," I said. "The house is sold." Andre went pale. Tiffany's jaw clenched. They had expected bargaining power. I had removed it carefully, legally. Their attempts to outmaneuver me found no purchase. The notary's pen remained idle in the car. They had assumed I would be the kind of mother to acquiesce to keep peace. Instead, I had traded their assumed safety net for my own new life. I kissed both of them on the forehead, kissed them as a mother, and walked out to the truck. The image of me walking down the steps without screaming, without pleading, without spectacle, was a small and perfect rebellion. The last thing I did before I left Chicago was sit on the stoop with a paper cup of coffee and the sold sign behind me. I watched my children huddle on the sidewalk, talking fast and low, their shoulders bent. I didn't eavesdrop. I sipped coffee and let the sun hit my face. My chest felt empty and unbelievably full at once, an oddness like being given a second chance at an old age. I kissed the edges of a life and stepped onto a plane for the first time in 15 years, my suitcase carrying more history than clothing. It took 48 hours for the first ripple to reach back to Chicago. Photos of the sold sign circulated in the neighborhood group chat. Mr. Jenkins from the corner store called to ask if I was really leaving. But the real consequences unfolded in conversations I didn't orchestrate. Andre called me from a booth of panic, voices echoing in the background. "We thought, Mom, we were sure the sale would be quick." He sounded like a boy again, not the one who'd helped himself to my checkbook. I listened as he explained that the supplier had called to demand payment and that their small line of credit had been frozen because of missed payments. Without the promise of my house sale, their safety net had vanished overnight. Tiffany's news was worse. She'd given notice at the apartment she'd been squatting in with promises of impending income. "Landlords do not hold faith as a form of security." She texted, then called, voice shredded. "They're changing the lease," she said. "The co-signer is demanding payment." It turned out they had been depending on a short closing window to bail out both of them. Without the sale proceeds, loans came due, collections advanced, and the comfortable assumption of financial reprieve detonated. An unexpected twist arrived when Lakeview Bank, one of the small creditors, served a notice on Andre's catering truck to repossess equipment for non-payment. He posted a desperate stream of messages, pleading for a temporary hold. The suppliers, who had grown tired of trust, began to call their other clients. The catering business lost its regular accounts within days because of missed deliveries that couldn't be covered without the truck's refrigeration working properly. Tiffany's partner at the boutique cafe, who'd been covering expenses with a credit line secured by his own home, found the bank calling that line due to a default triggered by unpaid invoices. In 2 weeks, what had been a messy but survivable scramble turned into a cascade. Neighbors who had once nodded sympathetically started whispering in a different tone. There's a kind of social accounting in neighborhoods. Some favors are remembered, but so are the debts of dependency. My absence exposed the structural propping that had been keeping their lives from collapsing, and when the prop was removed, the shoring gave way. Suppliers sued, landlords filed notices. Without the brownstone equity to fluidly cover shortfalls, court notices started arriving to their apartments and small shop fronts. One afternoon, unable to bear the weight of what was happening, Tiffany showed up at my new building in Miami. She had flown down without warning, eyes rimmed with red, voice thin. "Mom, please," she said, "we're going to lose everything." She seemed smaller to me somehow, not because of the tears, but because the entitlement had finally met reimbursement. She expected I would bring the house back into my hands somehow, or wire money or sign papers that renovated my life into their lifeline again. I sat across from her on a small balcony table, palm trees bent by a playful breeze. There was a sound below, music from a salsa class at the community center, laughing elders stepping lively into rhythm. Tiffany spilled the details like someone who had been trying to count birds as they flew away. Unpaid invoices, defaulted credit cards, a landlord's eviction notice. She begged, she pleaded, she offered apologies, bargaining, plans. "Give us just one more week," she said. "We'll fix it." Her desperation was loud. But there was another twist. Andre learned that a partner in his business had also taken a small emergency loan using company paperwork without his knowledge. When that partner vanished with wire transfers, suppliers stopped believing in the company's solvency. They sued. The legal entanglement accelerated debts. Neither Andre nor Tiffany had prepared for their own choices to be the storm that swept them. Their entitlements had been cushions made from other people's labor, and once the cushion was gone, the fall was raw. I didn't gloat. That was not my way. I watched the ripple of consequences as if observing a lesson taught by life's own strict pedagogy. I paid for a consultation for both of them, not to bail them out, but to help them face reality. Bankruptcy counseling, tenant rights, and a call to a small business advisor who could help Andre file for relief. I helped them find a list of legal aid clinics. Those were small mercies, practical and unromantic. I refused to be their bank or their co-signer. I had been that for far too long. Word traveled. At church, some folks murmured that I had been too hard. Others said I had been brave. Pastor Elaine hugged me and said, "You did what you had to do to survive, sister." And that was enough blessing for the moment. The neighborhood where the brownstone once stood lit up in its own ways. There were disagreements about developers and the erosion of familiar faces. My selling the house became a small cultural moment, a sudden reminder that even the most seemingly permanent anchors can be moved. For Andre and Tiffany, the roof they believed unshakable had been removed. For me, the roof that sheltered my heart had been reopened. Weeks turned into months. Miami's weather softened my mornings like balm. I took salsa lessons at a community center and found that my feet remembered rhythm even if my shoulders had forgotten how to relax. I met women whose names I learned slowly. Evelyn, who'd been widowed at 67 and now taught chair yoga. Rosa, who ran a small bakery and always had a lemon cookie in her bag. Marcia, who'd come from New Orleans and hummed old hymns between steps. My days filled with classes, coffee, a library card, and the slow joy of learning to sleep without thinking about who would call at 2 a.m. wanting money. Then the calls started again, not begging this time, but apologies. Andre phoned more than once, the line caught between contrition and pride. Tiffany left messages that stitched apology to bargaining. They wanted help with deposits, with emergency rent, with repairs. I listened on the balcony once, the Atlantic wind lifting my hair. The first time Tiffany knocked at my door in Miami, I opened it because she was family, and because I knew how loss narrows people's options. She stood on the threshold, suitcases rumpled, eyes wet. Behind her was a small duffel, everything she hadn't thought she'd need. "Mom," she said, voice uneven. "I'm sorry." She expected tears, or at least a breakdown that would invite rescuing. Instead, I offered a cup of tea and a chair. I listened to the litany of mistakes. At the end, she held out an envelope. "I can pay you back," she promised. "I'll start on Monday." Her voice scrambled for a plan. I took the envelope in my hand. Inside was a note, half apologetic, half bargaining. I handed it back. "Bless your heart, but I'm done," I said calmly. I didn't spoon out judgment or offer a theatrical rebuke. I was a woman who knew her limits. I told her about a job posting for a manager at a bakery where Rosa often needed help, and about the bankruptcy counseling session scheduled on Tuesday. I offered resources, not rescue. Tiffany's face changed, shock, then understanding, then a thin, tight acceptance. Andre tried other routes. He showed up at my salsa class once, awkward in an old shirt, and with hands that needed practice, not just at dancing. He asked if I could help him find work at a local catering spot where his skills might transfer. I agreed to meet the owner, told him honestly what I knew about Andre's strengths, and let the job be his responsibility. I would not sign the checks. I did not want my solitude to be a punishing absence. I wanted it to be a stable, predictable boundary that protected my peace. The most powerful rejection was my silence. When Tiffany called at 3 a.m. after a panic attack and asked me to wire money, I didn't answer. I turned the phone over, brewed tea, and watched the Miami skyline light up. I did not take pleasure in their discomfort. I made room in my heart for both compassion and protection. Healing for me was the accumulation of tiny, ordinary acts: buying a new set of sheets, planting a small herb garden on the balcony, laughing at something absurd on television. Those moments were quiet proof of a life reassembled. My days settled into rituals that felt like reclamation. I walked on the boardwalk and felt my joints remember movement without obligation. I volunteered once a week at the library, helping older adults learn email. I danced on Thursday nights and came home with a sweat-damp shirt and a grin I hadn't seen in years. I fed pigeons sometimes, and one morning a neighbor banged on my door to tell me a hummingbird was drinking from my feeder. "You brought good luck," she said. I smiled and went back to my mug. Occasionally, someone from Chicago would post an update in the neighborhood group. Andre took a job washing dishes at a family-run restaurant. Tiffany moved into a smaller apartment with a roommate and began back-to-back shifts at a bakery. They were rebuilding. I watched the announcements like a distant parent at a Little League game, quietly proud and privately relieved that their independence was not being replaced by dependence on me. When they came back to beg, once, twice, 3 times, I met them with the same calm I had used when I accepted the sale. "Bless your heart, but I'm done," I said, each time the phrase as gentle and absolute as closing a door. They looked angered, sometimes ashamed, often bewildered that I would not write checks or co-sign loans. My refusal was not revenge dressed in vindictiveness. It was a reestablishment of self, an understanding that my life did not revolve around being an unpaid creditor for the emotional debts of others. The story did not end with fireworks. It ended with sunlight through sheer curtains, with the faint smell of lemon and the sound of salsa music on my phone. One morning, as dawn unfurled over Biscayne Bay, I stood on my balcony in slippers and held a small pot of basil. I pinched the leaves for the first time and breathed in their green, peppery scent. The gesture was ordinary, small-stemmed basil between my fingers, but it felt like a benediction. I had loved, I had given, and then, when love threatened to smother me, I had chosen softness instead. I did not dramatize my departure from the brownstone into a speech. I simply folded an old napkin and put it into a drawer labeled "Keep." It was a little domestic ritual honoring my past without relinquishing my future. I watched the sunrise, felt the warmth seep into my palms, and turned my face to the light. My hands smelled of basil and lemon. My heart was in a steady, unhurried rhythm. I did not tell anyone I had learned a lesson. I let the quiet image of my balcony chair, the basil, and the morning sea be the end of the story. There was no triumphant shout and no spectacle of punishment. There was, instead, a small, fierce peace I chose every morning with a cup of coffee, a new playlist for my salsa steps, and a mailbox that held only my mail. The day my children realized the world did not collapse without me was the day they learned to stand on their own. The day I stood on my balcony and felt the breeze lift a hair from my face was the day I stopped carrying everyone else and started protecting my own peace.